Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
So, just a quick heads up on what this is. Think of it less like a book report, and it's definitely not advice. What we're really doing here is building a kind of blueprint, a model, so we can look at a really complex system from a new angle. Okay, let's dive in. The source material we're digging into today is The Common Good, which is a collection of interviews with Noam Chomsky. And we're going to use it as a kind of case study, right? To map out a really specific system, how concentrated private power interacts with and reshapes the democratic institutions that are, theoretically supposed to keep it in check. And to break all this down, we've got a 5-part arc. First, we'll define the system itself. What are we even talking about? Then we'll look at the incentives that make it tick. After that, we'll see the results, the predictable outcomes. Then we'll ask, how does this whole thing stick around? And finally, we'll zoom out and see how it all connects on a global level. All right, so first up, let's talk about the system itself. What is this architecture of influence we're actually looking at? So, the source kicks things off with this quote from John Dewey, and it really sets the stage. The idea here is pretty straightforward. When you have big business, or any highly concentrated private power, politics tends to become its shadow. Now, our goal here isn't to argue whether that's good or bad, but just to understand the mechanics of the system that this quote describes.
Okay, to really get a grip on this system, there's a key term the source uses: private tyrannies. It sounds dramatic, but what it's describing are those massive, powerful private institutions, think big corporations, that aren't really accountable to the public, yet have a huge say in our lives, from the laws that get passed to the jobs we have.
And this right here, this is the central conflict. On one hand, we have the democratic ideal we all know: power rests with the people. But on the other hand, the source argues that the system was designed with a different principle in mind. It points to early thinkers like James Madison, who were concerned about giving too much power to the majority, and instead wanted to place it in the hands of the wealth of the nation to protect property and stability. That tension is really what we're unpacking today.
Okay, so if that's the basic design, how does it actually work in practice? What drives its behavior? Well, that brings us to our next section, the incentives. In other words, how are the rules of the game really written?
And the best way to think about this, according to the analysis, is to picture a tilted playing field. It's a great metaphor. It doesn't mean there aren't any rules to the game. It just means the most powerful players got to write the rulebook, and, surprise, surprise, the field is tilted in their favor. And here's how that tilted field works, laid out in a kind of 4-step loop. Step 1. Global labor arbitrage. That's a fancy way of saying you can move your operations anywhere in the world to find the cheapest labor and fewest rules. Step 2. Get public subsidies. You get cities and states to basically compete against each other to give you tax breaks and other perks. Step 3. Socialize the risk. This is a big one. It means when a big bet goes south, taxpayers are the ones who end up footing the bill. And finally, Step 4. Privatize the profit. After all that public support and risk-taking, the profits, well, those stay in private hands. So, when you put it all together, the source makes a really critical argument. It's that the real goal here isn't to compete in some idealized free market. The real goal is to gain the power to shape and control that market. Okay, so if the name of the game is consolidating power, what are the results on the ground? What does this system actually produce? That leads us straight into our third section, the predictable outcomes. And what do things look like from the public's point of view? Well, the numbers tell a pretty stark story. The source cites polls showing that a huge majority, we're talking over 80% of people, feel that the economic system is inherently unfair. Just think about that. A vast majority believe working people have way too little influence. And beyond just perception, the analysis points to some very concrete outcomes. Things like the weakening of unions, what the business press itself apparently called capital's clear subjugation of labor. Or think about underfunded public services, like LA's public transit system, which gets a mention, or our crumbling infrastructure. All of these things, the source argues, are symptoms that lead to a predictable result. Wealth gets more and more concentrated at the top. So that raises a really big question, right? If so many people feel the system is unfair, how does it keep going? How does it maintain its legitimacy? Well, that's what our fourth section is all about: how perception is shaped. And this is where we get to the core concept of a crisis in perception. The idea is that the very language we use to talk about the economy can actually obscure what's happening. Words like free markets or democracy can be used in ways that hide the actual mechanics of power. Let's look at a couple of clear examples from the text.
Okay, let's take the phrase free trade. When you hear that, you probably picture different countries competing fairly on an open market. But the reality, according to the source, is often something very different. A massive portion of what we call trade is actually just huge corporations moving components and products between their own branches in different countries. It's more like a centrally managed corporate operation than a free and open market.
Here's another great example: the media. The rhetoric might be that privatizing media gives people more choice, that it's democratic, but the analysis here flips that on its head. It argues that when you hand over something as critical as the media to what it calls private tyrannies, these large, unaccountable corporations, you're actually taking it away from democratic control, not adding to it.
All right, let's bring it all together in our final section. We need to see how this isn't just a national issue, but a global design. And here's the big paradox. For all its talk of free markets, this system is incredibly dependent on the power of the state.
And this is where things get really interesting. On the one hand, a lot of effort goes into weakening the state's democratic functions, to get rid of regulations and oversight. But on the other hand, that same state power is absolutely crucial for the system to work. The state provides subsidies, it funds the high-risk R&D that private companies later profit from, and maybe most importantly, it's there to provide bailouts when things go wrong. I mean, the source points out that over 20 of the Fortune 100 companies would have gone under without public bailouts. That's pretty significant.
And that really leads us to the core point of this whole analysis. The big takeaway is that this system, it's not a force of nature. It isn't like gravity. It's a set of rules, institutions, and decisions made by people. And if it was built by people, well, that means it can be understood and it can be changed by people too.
And that leaves us with the powerful question the source itself ends on. It reminds us that things we once thought were permanent and unchangeable, like formal slavery or the divine right of kings, were eventually dismantled. So, if that's possible, what are the limits to changing the powerful institutions we live with today?
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a longer audio-based analysis of this topic, see the deep dive linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.